So today I'm talking about all of the books that I read in March. So stick around to see what they were, and I did read some good ones. Well, hey friends, Roger here, and welcome to my channel, Roger's Reads. So today I'm doing my March wrap-up where I talk about all the books that I read during the month of March. You know, usually I break this up into two parts, but I didn't this month, so I'll try not to ramble on too long about each one. So the first book I want to talk about is entitled Open Water. It was actually an ebook, so I don't have the physical book here. But The Open Water follows a young black man and woman in their 20s who meet at a pub and fall in love. It's a contemporary story, and the man's a photographer and the woman is a dancer based out of Dublin. So interestingly, their entire story is told in snippets, in tiny snapshots of life, so we're not really following the events chronologically. Additionally, the story is recounted in second-person point of view, which does lend a sense of present time to the narration. Though to me, I always find second-person kind of jarring, second-person narration kind of jarring, and I really don't like it all that much. But I did get used to it in this book. So the story is told from the male's point of view and starts out by focusing on their relationship, how they meet, their initial awkwardness, getting to know each other, him wanting more than friendship, and how they make the leap from friends to lovers. Now what's funny is that we never learn our characters' names. They're only referred to as you, which is the male, and she and her. I did find it refreshing to read a story about love told from the male's perspective, including all of his doubts, fears, excitement, and vulnerability. But in addition to focusing on the relationship between these two young people, the book also looks at what it's like to be young, black, and in your 20s and living in London. There's a lot of discussion about racial profiling, the mistreatment of young black men by police, and how criminality is almost always assumed merely because of skin color. The book was actually raw and heart-wrenching in places as the author describes in detail how time and time again unsuspecting black men are thrown to the ground, knee in the back, and interrogated. You know, we really got a feeling of how overwhelmingly exhausting, frightening, and risky it can be to even leave the house when the constant threat of assumed criminality is always present. You know, I felt that the author really captured extremely well the main character's weariness and exhaustion at being constantly marginalized. And though the story is written in prose, you know, I almost felt as though I were reading verse, as it was so beautiful and so lyrical. And through the lush, ethereal prose, the author captures and brings forth several powerful themes such as marginalization, fear, vulnerability, being seen versus being unseen, racism, microaggression, brutality, dating, and young love. So I thought this was a wise and painful book, a deeply moving and poignant character-driven story that speaks of the times that we live in. Additionally, the visceral style of writing and breathtaking metaphors really capture the emotion and tenderness between this couple, I thought. So this book, it's unsettling and troubling, yet strangely beautiful at the same time. A very different type of love story. So the next book that I read was entitled Dead Sea by Mia Carrick. And this story follows Lenny, a 17-year-old talented creative kid who loves to sew and dress up in costumes, kind of like cosplay. So after an upsetting event during which all of his secrets risk exposure, Lenny, unable to face the potential humiliation, decides to walk into the ocean and never return. So he walks out, he's caught in a riptide and begins to drown when he is rescued by the unlikeliest of heroes, one of the school's biggest and meanest bullies, Kyle. So what follows is a transformation of both of these characters following the incident. So with Kyle, it was so much fun to watch him transform from a bully into a caring individual who continues to not only surprise those around him, but surprise himself as well. So with Kyle and Lenny, we have two teenagers who have both gone through difficult times, but have dealt with them in entirely different ways. Lenny by becoming nearly invisible at school. In fact, his nickname is Zip Lip because he hardly ever talks. And Kyle, the bully, hiding behind his bullying facade and his tough attitude. So in this way, both boys hid from the world in their own way. So I really enjoyed the transformation as both boys evolved into something more, with each discovering themselves and each other in the process. I loved seeing their connection strengthen as the days passed, and they both started changing, both defying society's expectations and overcoming their personal trauma. So it's really heartwarming how one of the school's most terrifying individuals became a hero, and how this fact affected everyone around them, but most of all, himself and Lenny. So the author, Mia Carrick, really seems to understand the teenage soul, the longing, the self-awareness, the challenges, the fear, and the confusion. You know, there was real depth to this story as it delves into some pretty serious themes, such as suicide, bullying, depression, parental rejection. There's abandonment, survival, homophobia, and fitting in, all of which I thought that the author handled expertly and compassionately. Now, though the book is layered with complexities of identity and societal expectations, ultimately Dead Sea ends up being a beautifully written story about friendship, redemption, and first love. So the next book that I read during March was entitled The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. Now, I've read a couple of other books by this author, Magic for Liars, and what was the other one? When We Were Magic. I keep forgetting the name of that book. And I really enjoyed both of them, but I have to say that this is my favorite of the lot. I also talked about this a little bit during a previous Thriller Thursday, so I'll put up a card for that video. Hopefully I'll remember to do that, so you can check out the entire video on this book. So the story takes place in the not-so-distant future and follows an award-winning scientist named Evelyn Caldwell, whose work involves clone technology in which she's able to perfectly replicate human beings using their DNA. Now, unbeknownst to Evelyn, her scheming husband Nathan has stolen her research and created a genetic clone of her, of Evelyn, named the clone Martine, and ended up having an affair with the clone. So the idea here was that the husband made Martine with the qualities that he wanted in a woman. Basically a new and improved version of Evelyn, if you will. So it kind of has a little Stepford Wives vibe to it as well. So he ends up leaving his wife, Evelyn, and moves in with the clone, Martine. So things get really bonkers when the husband ends up dead on Martine's kitchen floor and she calls Evelyn for help. Now the problem with all this for Evelyn is that if word got out that her research was used in such a manner, it would be the end of her career, her funding, and her legacy. So she finds that it's in her best interest to work together with her clone to fix the situation. So the two Mrs. Caldwells end up having to work together to remedy the mess. So what follows is a high-tension story where if the two women don't succeed, they will both lose everything. There's also an extremely complex and compelling relationship, kind of a dark sisterhood that develops between the two women. Now, apart from the ethics of clones, there were many other serious issues that the book addressed, such as, in the case of Nathan, the mistreatment, objectification, and the abuse of women, as well as toxic masculinity. Additionally, there were plenty of shocking and satisfying plot twists that really ended up sucking me in even further. You know, I love the idea that I had no idea where this book was heading, and it took me into some places I didn't really expect. So yeah, this ended up being a wild, fascinating, fast-paced sci-fi thriller that I ended up loving. So the next book that I read during March was entitled Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. So Green Lights is a memoir written by the author himself, Matthew McConaughey, and the main reason that I picked it up was that he narrated the audiobook himself. So the book contains lots of fun little stories and lots of reminiscing. I enjoyed hearing about his Hollywood career firsthand and the events of his life that led up to it. So the book was quite rambling at times, and I guess that's to be expected given that it's a memoir, though it does have many nuggets of advice and wisdom gained from lessons learned. I thought it was enjoyable in places and quite odd in others, such as when Matthew follows his wet dreams in search of their meaning. So if you didn't think Matthew McConaughey was odd before reading this book, you'll definitely think so afterwards. But all in all, I found him witty, breezy, and easy to listen to, and he does have some compelling stories to tell. You know, I always have a hard time chatting about memoirs, nonfiction memoirs, given that we're talking about someone's life here. So it's always kind of hard for me to give them a rating, you know. I give Your Life 2 stars. But you know, I really don't read a lot of memoirs, as I'm more of a fiction guy myself. But for people who like Matthew McConaughey as an actor, you may enjoy this book. I did. So again, after reading it, you may realize how weird he actually really is. But I guess that we're all pretty weird, aren't we? So the next book that I read was entitled The Players Encore, written by Joe Constantino. So this is the second book in this series, the Piano Player Mysteries, and we again follow Andre Beaufort and his ghostly lover, Freddie Birtwistle, I think his name is, Birtwistle. And the two of them solve crimes and travel to homes that formerly belonged to Freddie's family. So like the first book in the series, this volume actually contains two novellas entitled The Beach House and The Villa. So The Beach House takes place in Freddie's former home in Key West, where we learn that the head houseboy was murdered there 5 years prior. As it turns out, the same thing occurs again, and someone murders the head houseboy at the house by pushing him off the balcony. So Andre and Freddie take it upon themselves, once again, to investigate. So the second book, The Villa, takes place in Tuscany, where Andre and his uncle Daryl book a stay at a gay-friendly villa that once belonged to Freddie's family. So this time a wealthy guest drops dead during dinner, and the detective in the case, knowing that Andre has solved other murders, requests his assistance. So these were both pretty zany and fast-paced whodunits with oddball secondary characters and plenty of 1920s humor from Freddie. Now, because Freddie is attached to the pianos and cannot leave the room where the piano is located, Andre does all the legwork again of interviewing the guests. And through his interviews with the wacky and some cases despicable characters, we get to piece together the mysteries step by step, though there are a few red herrings thrown in to keep the reader guessing. The murder mysteries at the core of these books were quite gripping and twisted, with both keeping me guessing until the end. I found the stories to be equally quirky and delightful, and like the first book, we get a mixture of contemporary society along with Freddie's scandalous stories from the roaring 20s, and the humor provided many laugh-out-loud moments. There are definitely some fairly silly, over-the-top developments and plot twists, but they're all part of the whimsy and the fun of these books. So yeah, another fun and entertaining cozy mystery in the Piano Players Mystery Series. So the next book that I read in March was actually another nonfiction book. It was entitled River Queens, written by Alexander Watson. So this is the engaging story of Alexander Watson and Dale Harris, their amazing Dalmatian Doris Fay, and their antique designer boat, Betty Jane, which is a 1955 Chris craft that they restored themselves and made seaworthy. It's a wooden yacht, actually. So the book is nonfiction, as I mentioned, and it's kind of a slice of life story that follows their journey from restoring their boat to their trip through several states on the rivers of America. And these two are lovers, by the way. So the author does not hide the fact that a boat renovation project like this one can be kind of rough in a relationship. And it was compelling how they both solved their problems, both the boating problems and the relationship ones. The two of them really formed an admirable team, though a bit of drama did sneak in from time to time. What was fun was watching the two men figure out their boat and learn river culture as they went along. And we got to see just how arduous a process it was. So basically the fellows entered into a whole new world with its own rules, lingo, culture, and expectations. But luckily the guys were often able to rely on friendly locals for advice. Now, speaking of locals, this is where the book really shined. The descriptions of the colorful and fascinating people they met along the way. So the author uses colloquial dialogue and phonetic spelling, which took me a little bit to adjust to. But once I did, I loved it, and I felt that it really added so much to this narrative. You know, I could almost hear their voices in my head and as I read, which really added an extra compelling element to the book. So though this book is indeed an emotional and personal journey, the book's not only about Watson and Harris, but it's about connecting with people, about acceptance, helping others, and finding one's place in the world. This travel narrative really grabbed me from the get-go, and before I knew it, I was lost in their story. So by the end, I felt as though I was part of Dale and Alexander's journey myself, and I am so glad that this book ended up coming to my attention. So yeah, River Queens. So the next book that I read was entitled The Reincarnationist Papers, written by Eric Makrans. I think that's how you pronounce his name, Makrans. So those of you who know me know that I love twisty stories about past lives and secret organizations. So the synopsis of this book grabbed my attention right away. So the story follows a fellow named Evan Michaels, a professional arsonist for hire. Now Evan, however, is different than most people in that he's living with 3 complete sets of memories inside of his head, his current life and the complete memories of 2 other people. He kind of suspects that he's crazy and lives life the best he can. So then he meets a woman named Poppy who recognizes Evan for what he really is, someone who has complete recall of their past lives. As it turns out, Poppy has lived 7 consecutive lives herself, so in this way she's much, much older than Evan. So she subsequently invites him to apply to a secret society called the Cognomina. The Cognomina, a group for people who are like the both of them, immortals who can recall all of their past lives. But first, Evan has to go through a series of tests to prove that he is, in fact, one of them. And in so doing, we go more into depth with his past lives, as well as the others in the society via the narrative and flashback. So, I found the drama and the interwoven secrets between the members of the society throughout their many lives to be really compelling and a lot of fun. But what was entertaining about this book was it felt like it was a non-fiction story, a sort of documentary in which the author supposedly comes across these reincarnationist papers in an antique bookstore in Rome and is now sharing these notebooks in book format for all of us to read and ponder. So in this way, I found the world building to be phenomenal. And I thought that this aspect of the book was such a unique and refreshing take on the past life genre and really added to the story's overall enjoyment for me. It was fascinating how all of the characters no longer feared death at all because they knew that they'd be coming right back. So So this was quite an interesting philosophy on the overall theme of death to ponder. We're also treated to a delightful set of eccentric and hedonistic personalities in the cognomina, all of which added an essential element to the story. So each character was captivating and described in such detail that I could easily picture having a conversation with any one of them, resulting in a vivid and atmospheric story. I really enjoyed the character arc of Evan, our main character, as he experienced considerable character growth throughout the book, as he learned to accept that he is not, in fact, crazy. Additionally, by the end of the book, we learn the origin of the Reincarnationist Papers, who wrote them and why. But that's all I'll say about that, lest we move into spoiler territory. But I can say that the Reincarnationist Papers is a delightful and enthralling read that makes you ponder who you are, where you come from, and what your responsibilities are to both. So the book is told in alternating perspectives with crisp writing, and I found it to be quite a thought-provoking story, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So the next book that I read was entitled Portals and Puppy Dogs, written by Amy Lane. And this is the second book in the Hedge Witches Lonely Hearts Club series. And I've talked about, and I did redo a review of the first book. I talked about it during a wrap-up. And for those of you who know me, you know that I love witchy books, and I'm really enjoying this series. So in this book, the events pick up 2 weeks after where the previous book left off. This time we're following Coven member Alex Kennedy, an accountant working at Reddick, Lockhart and Baldwin Accounting, who has been hopelessly in love with his boss, Simon Reddick, for the past 2 years. The crush has become so unbearable that Alex has put in for a transfer to get away from the man. The kicker is that Simon is also crushing on Alex and lets him know about it, begging him to please stay with the company. So Alex agrees, and each man takes a few tentative romantic steps toward the other. So by day, Alex is a shy accountant, but by night, he works with his coven, desperately trying to undo the catastrophic spell that they cast a couple of weeks prior, resulting in the disappearance of 2 members of their friend group or coven circle, both of who are now kind of trapped in this in-between world. So they're kind of here, but they're not. So Alex then draws a surprised and wide-eyed Simon into his witchcraft/friendship circle, and slowly Simon learns not only about Alex, but also about witchcraft, their unfortunate spell, and the other coven members. So it's also quite clear in the book that magic itself is intervening to bring the 2 men together, and through the process, Alex's truest desire is revealed. But this is kind of key to the story because during the disastrous spell in the first book, each coven member had to write down what they desired most. So what's fun about this story, though, is how the witches are more or less winging it here. They really don't know what they're doing for the most part, and more times than not, they create magic without even knowing it. What I do love is how devoted they are not only to their craft, but also to each other. There is quite a deep and heartwarming friendship and familial loyalty between them, and it's clear that they would do anything for each other. So initially shocked by the existence of magic and witches, Simon subsequently decides that he wants to help and figure out a way to return their absent friends, so he ends up offering his assistance. Now, it was really a lot of fun watching Simon and Alex move closer together throughout the pages, and how each of their preconceptions about the other were slowly destroyed in the process. I also liked how this enchanting story combines the sweetness of love and attraction with the deep bonds of friendship and created family. And that's what we see with the coven here. So brewed together, they make really a beautiful and moving story, and ode to family in every sense of the word. So the next book that I read was entitled The Cost of Knowing by Brittany Morris. And The Cost of Knowing is a young adult novel that follows 16-year-old Alex Rufus, a black teen, and his 12-year-old little brother Isaiah, whose parents were killed in a car accident a few years prior. Now, Alex is not quite like other kids because ever since the accident, he has this gift of psychometry. That is to say, he can see the future whenever he touches an object or a person. So for instance, if he touches an ice cream scoop at work, he sees himself using the ice cream scoop a few minutes later. Or if he touches his car, he sees it wrecked and underwater several years from now. He also saw his childhood best friend's death a few years prior. So since then, he pretty much lives in constant state of anxiety surrounding his gift. So this burdensome ability also makes it challenging for Alex to maintain relationships because ever since he foresaw his friend's death, he's generally avoided touching the people he cares about, which isn't always easy to accomplish and also which has led to additional complications for Alex. For instance, it's causing some conflict between him and his girlfriend who isn't aware of Alex's gift and doesn't understand why Alex won't hold her hand. But one day his world turns completely upside down when, after picking up an old family photo, he sees the funeral of his little brother Isaiah. So Alex knows that the events of his visions cannot be prevented. He's tried. What he sees always comes to pass. So now Alex is determined to be the best brother possible during Isaiah's remaining days and to do everything in his power to ensure that his last days are safe and happy. And of course to try to prevent this tragedy from occurring if he can. So though this is the story of two brothers, at its core, the book is also about what it means to be a young black man today. In fact, the author dedicates this book to all the black boys who had to grow up too early. So as Alex attempts to protect his brother, we witness how the boys have to deal with the realities of how racism, stereotypes, and constant microaggressions, especially given that they live in a primarily white neighborhood. We see their continuous fear and anxiety of being targeted as criminals because of the color of their skin. So the author illustrates nicely how people can be racist without believing that they're racist. But as for the two boys, I really love the beautiful relationship that developed between the two brothers. So up to this point, they were mostly estranged because Isaiah spent all of his time secluded in his room. And as it turns out, Isaiah has his own secrets. But it really ended up warming my heart to see the two boys open up to each other, and experience joy together. So though at times the story was heartbreaking, the cost of knowing is also uplifting. It ends up being a gripping and magical book that's relevant, moving, and poignant. I really, really loved this brilliant book. I ended up giving it 5 stars. So the last book that I want to talk about is entitled Every Last Fear, written by Alex Finlay. So this is a tension-packed gripper of a story that follows college student Matt Pine, who returns to his dorm room after a night of partying to be greeted by Agent Sarah Keller of the FBI. And I also did a Thriller Thursday of this, so I'll post a card up above so you can check out that video if you like. So he's greeted by the FBI in his dorm, and the agent informs him that his entire family, his mother, father, his sister, and little brother, were all found dead in their hotel room in Mexico where they were vacationing. Apparently they were killed by a gas leak. Now, this isn't the first time that the Pine family has made headlines. Matt's older brother is actually in prison serving a life sentence for the murder of his girlfriend Charlotte after a high school party. So the crime became very high profile after it was featured in a Netflix documentary that went viral. So the taped footage of the police interview in that documentary showed that Danny was pretty much coerced into a confession that there really wasn't any solid evidence pointing toward his guilt. But regardless, he was convicted of murder and is now in prison. And his family, the Pine family, has never given up trying to exonerate him, and they've pretty much bankrupted themselves in the process. So after some investigation, the FBI then concludes that the family's death was no accident, that they were in fact murdered, and Matt may be next on the list. So now he has to figure out what happened to his family without getting killed in the process. So in this way, we have kind of a cat and mouse scenario going on here. Now, added to the intrigue, we have subsequently learned as the story unfolds that Matt's family was in Mexico, not really vacationing, but they were following a lead about Danny's case. So the question is, was their murder connected to Charlotte's murder, or were they killed for an entirely different reason? But you know, with this book, it was really, though it was a gripping and exciting plot line, it was the extremely well-developed characters that truly made this book an addictive read. And what's interesting about the story is that it's told from several different point of views. So we get the FBI agent's point of view and Matt's point of view in the present, but we also get the point of view of the dead family members, Maggie, Evan, and Olivia, before and leading up to their time in Mexico. So these bits of the book were especially heart-wrenching to read, knowing the fate that awaits them. But they really lent an especially intriguing element to the narrative, and I enjoyed getting to know each of these family members. Each of the narratives was really essential to the plotline and key in telling the story, even though it did break my heart to fall in love with all of them. So, did you like this video? If so, please click the like button below, as that really helps my channel out. And as always, I thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of your support, and I'll talk to you all in the next video. Roger and out.